Welcome back, everybody, to the 4 Stars Today's Market Explained podcast. And today we have an interview podcast as compared to the regular market commentary podcast that we do. And we've been on the subject of energy now for a number of years in the 4 Star Today's Market Explained podcast. We've had oil people, battery people, energy people of all different types. We have a really special lady to join us today. We have Catherine Von Burg, and Catherine is the founder, president, and CEO of SimpliPhi Power, Inc., and they're involved in a whole series of new energy businesses, and we want to hear from Catherine about what's going on in that world. Catherine, welcome to the 4 Star Today's Market Explained podcast.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really pleased to be here.
Excellent. Well, we've had an interesting discussion prior to our taping of this event, and I thought maybe the best thing to do would be to first have you just tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got into this business. You didn't start in this business, you started in a different business. So let's hear a little bit about you and your evolution, and then we can get into some questions about energy and how all things work.
Sure. People often look at my background and wonder how on earth I became engaged in energy storage, specifically in the technology development there. The truth is, this company, and I always look at people's careers and look for those that do not have a linear path necessarily. The more diverse a team, the more diverse a worldview of a team member, the more material and synergy can come about. Certainly in a company that's innovative, where a lot of research and development needs to take place. So yes, my background primarily is in biomedical research, but a lot of the principles that I really became engaged in then in biomedical engineering apply to thinking about and founding SimpliPhi Power. And really that is becoming involved in research and development, thinking about problems that are in a market that really need to be addressed and solved. And so research for research's sake, for me, I love research, but it always has to have a direct application to solving a problem. And so whether in my past it was a medical or surgical or drug therapy and intervention, the R&D that we were engaged in had to have a commercial application. And how is this going to play out in the market? What problems would it solve? How do we commercialize? Everything else. So all those principles, of course, lend themselves to energy storage. In the early days in 2010, when we founded the company, really looking at energy storage to solve a number of problems that we were already seeing in the field. And one is intermittency. And in 2010, intermittency was thought of as a problem that was relegated and concentrated within the renewable energy space. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and you can talk about hydro, et cetera, but sticking with wind and sun primarily. So how do you solve the intermittency when the sun goes down? Well, you figure out a way to store it, and store it efficiently, cost effectively, and with an eye on long duration, lasting for many, many years, so that initial investment pays out. So the founding of the company, really looking at energy storage and our R&D, if we think about energy storage, eliminating resiliency. And then also another problem was greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 levels and climate change, and the beginnings of seeing the impact of climate change just on the economy. And so looking at energy storage there as well to solve for climate change, what's at the root of climate change, CO2 and greenhouse gases, and utilizing energy storage to help the transition to a higher portfolio of renewable energy. If you fast forward today, 2022, the comments I made about intermittency being relegated to renewable energy, that's no longer true. intermittency is every bit as relevant for top-down centralized distribution and transmission and distribution. And what we are seeing all over the country and indeed all over the world is that infrastructure is being wiped out by climate-related disasters. We've seen it in Texas, Florida, the East Coast, West Coast, certainly here in California. We're seeing it all over the world. So intermittency now is every bit as relevant for our traditional model of centralized generation, transmission, and distribution. How do we solve for that? Energy storage. And what we're seeing, in addition to catastrophic failure of infrastructure because of climate-related disasters, we're also seeing utilities shutting off the grid. And they're marketing it as public safety power shutoffs, PSPS. There is nothing safe about turning off the power to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of residents in any territory. So if the utilities really have to shut off the grid, or there are blackouts because the grid fails because of aging infrastructure that utilities have not invested in for 80, 100 years, and California certainly bears that out with the fires that have happened here because of transmission lines that are 85 years old. That's a problem. So how do we solve for that? Energy storage. Now, I will also point out for us as a company, back in 2010, when I thought about energy storage, thinking about large scale, absolutely large scale solar, wind farms, large scale battery farms. The problem with that model, while it does help offset greenhouse gas emissions, while it does help transition to a higher percentage of renewable clean power and storing that in large scale energy storage, it doesn't solve for intermittency and energy security, what we now call today in 2022 resilience.
Right.
And so for us as a company, if we're going to solve for intermittency and to create transition to a greater portfolio of renewables, and we want to create security, this resilience piece, then it has to be customer-sited assets, energy storage and generation assets at the home, at the business, at the hospital, the school, et cetera. And even in the early days when we began to work with the Department of Defense, specifically US Army and Marine Corps, developing solutions to deploy on forward operating bases in Afghanistan and Iraq, those issues were critical there. How do we offset fossil fuels? Because landed cost, $600 to $800 a gallon. How do we offset the intermittency and harness cleaner renewable energy? How do we optimize diesel generators? Because with generators on forward operating bases, you have a target on your back, gas, noise, fumes, et cetera. So the issue with generators that we found overseas applies to homeowners and certainly in emergency response situations in 2021 and 2022. The fires in California, all over the West Coast, you have fires, smog, pollution, raining ash, and the only backup power is a generator, which is creating even more fumes. Right. So early on, as a company, it was really critical for us to make it clear. We work with utilities, we work with power companies, but it's always within the context of distributed resources, energy storage paired with renewables, but also building in generators. Because if we can reduce the time that generators run, we're creating a solution that is an and. This is not an either or proposition between top-down centralized or distributed. It's not an either or zero-sum game between fossil fuels and renewables. It's an and. And with the technology that our company has been engaged in for years, the hardware certainly, but now firmware, software, solutions that can be deployed in a distributed way, but with the software blurring the line between what's in front of and behind the meter. So if the utility does shut down the grid or it fails, these assets can be deaggregated. Everybody has energy security with energy storage at their home, their business, their hospital, their school. But in good times, software and these aggregated assets can be combined as one large asset, and the utilities benefit from that as well.
So Catherine, is this part of the footprint project you were talking about as well? Is this part of the disaster protection programs that you're talking about?
Yes. So the Footprint Project designs and deploys mobile trailers that become effectively emergency response charging centers for first responders, but also residents in areas where centralized power has been wiped out, and very often other catastrophic events. But we started this type of work again in 2010 and 11. We were focused on residential customer-sited energy storage. What we found, though, is the Department of Defense came to us in 2010, 11. They had banned all lithium-ion batteries. And so this is one of the challenges for us in the early years. They had banned lithium-ion batteries because the earliest innovations were based on cobalt lithium batteries. So lithium cobalt oxide, LCO, the earliest, and now more recently NMC, NCA, and fast forward to 2020 and 2019, large scale fires like APS and others, battery recalls by companies because they are catching fire and even exploding and putting first responders into the hospital. For us as a company, when we founded, we are very mission-based, and we decided that even though lithium cobalt based battery chemistry is cheaper and it's more available, we are not going to win in the market because we have a lower cost product that puts our customers fundamentally at risk. So we were one of the few companies that chose lithium ferrophosphate. And I think you asked me a question earlier about what were some of the challenges founding in 2010. It was very challenging as a company going up against larger companies that were using cobalt-based lithium to choose LFP and to sell into the market to solve problems at a higher price point. But that was one of the challenges we were willing to take on. These issues still play out in the market today in 2022. Cobalt-based lithium batteries are cheaper, but they are the batteries that are overheating, causing massive battery recalls and fires and explosions. And our company has been able to prove out through the years the safety. Again, if we're thinking about energy storage as solving problems around resilience and security, energy security, then we need to think about a chemistry that is fundamentally safe, doesn't put the customer at risk, is not hazardous. And when we think about the energy transition, renewables, solar, wind, why store that clean energy in toxic, fundamentally hazardous batteries? So for us, that has always been part of our mission. And happy to say in 2020 and 21, we were also able to get through the UL standard test 9540 and 9540A, which is a very rigorous fire safety test that forces batteries, whatever the chemistry, into thermal runaway to see if they can force these independent test laboratories can force batteries to catch fire and worse explode. And we've been able to demonstrate whether it's a single battery or scaling up into larger systems over 100 kilowatt hours, that our batteries, even when they're artificially heated up through this 9548 process, they don't catch fire, they don't explode. So when we talk about creating energy security as a company and resilience, our batteries and the chemistry and the innovations in our manufacturing definitely back that up. But it hasn't
You mentioned, and no problem. You started talking about some of the challenges, and when you started the company, say 12 years ago or so, we've been having discussions about clean energy in America for a while, but it was all kinds of different related subjects. It was somewhat chaotic. It wasn't very well organized, and now it seems like this is really something that is real. Didn't seem real in the past, but it's really real now as the industry has really gone further. What other kind of challenges did you have back then when you first started?
Well, the regulatory environment is very challenging. Besides choosing a chemistry that was more expensive, so it didn't put us at an advantage on a price point in the market. The regulatory environment, the way utilities tend to look at customers who are spending their own hard-earned dollars to build clean generation, rooftop solar, even wind turbines that are designed for commercial, residential, community. The utilities really pushing against that and actually creating barriers. So the interconnection rules or requirements back in 2010, I would love to say that the utilities have come a long way. There are some, and we do work with utilities who are looking at distributed customer energy storage and generation assets as a value and building partnerships. But take California, for example, a state that is supposed to be on the forefront of innovation and clean energy. The California Public Utilities Commission, along with the utilities, are fighting hard against what's being called NEM 3, net energy metering. And they are putting in place real barriers when it comes to interconnection and requirements. Even the approval process through the permitting is taking anywhere from 6 to 14 months. And that can just be for a home. And we work very closely with our commercial project developers as well as residential. I myself have been on the phone with the AHJs, authorities having jurisdiction, codes and compliance, building departments, fire departments. I have been on the phone presenting our data through nationally recognized test laboratories, independent data, proving out the safety. And still, 9 months later, we were able to get a home online. So this is a real challenge. It was when we founded, and it is today. Utilities charging homeowners and business owners what effectively is being called a solar tax. And people who not only are going to put solar on their home, but have the Public Utilities Commission and the utilities effectively changing the terms going back years on the financials that cause people to put rooftop solar and batteries in their home in the first place, such that they don't realize the gains and the savings, the daily savings of offsetting utility use. Other
costs that they would not bear because they've got a new program.
Yes. Well, typically, if a homeowner or a business owner has energy storage alone, no solar, right, and you live in an area with time of use, like I do, my batteries can be deployed from 4 to 9 o'clock, and I can avoid those draconian time of use fees. It's even better. The return on that investment for customer-sided storage is even better for commercial businesses. But when you think about PG&E that has raised its rates about 39% since 2019, and time of use rates in San Diego can be as much as 67 cents per kilowatt, that's a problem. And when customers are being charged these additional fees, it undermines the state's mandates and even the utilities' targets for clean energy. And so what we see in California and other states, and even on a federal level, where policies are being put in place around clean energy, reducing CO2, et cetera, that don't support other policies put in place that have to do with interconnection and the customers, people's rights to invest in technology that they install in their own homes or own businesses without being charged by the utility.
So Catherine, that all sounds really good. Why would California then put up roadblocks, and are other states doing the same thing where they're not really cooperating?
Yes. And why would they?
Yeah, why would they?
Large power companies and
Politics, money.
vested interest are putting a lot of money in lobbying dollars. And I'm sorry to say, but elected officials who really should be thinking about the public good and what is happening. Looking at California, billions of dollars are lost in a 2-week period when PG&E shuts the power off. Billions to the California economy. Then when fires come through, we have billions in losses of just business, and then losses in property. We now have climate refugees, people who have been on the move because they have lost their homes. The economy can't sustain this, but elected officials, the Public Utilities Commission, are allowing these changes in the regulatory environment that are making it more costly for end users to make these investments, even when the utilities themselves have not been making these investments. And these customer-sided investments benefit everyone in terms of generating more clean energy and creating security and not losing power when the grid fails.
You would think, California is one of those states that is known nationally as being very forward about clean energy and things, but yet even there they play politics, and there's money involved and pressure, special interest groups and things like that. So it's quite interesting. And then of course there's resistance from other states as well, you said.
Oh yeah, some states have passed laws, and I won't. The point here is to talk about the issues, not to bash any one state. Or but there are states that have passed legislation that makes it illegal for people to go off grid, even though the grid is failing. The utilities are shutting the lights off, even when the grid hasn't failed. They will shut off the lights. They're allowed to do that. People want to build in generation in their own home and storage to get them through a night or days or weeks, and they are being prevented from doing so. And it doesn't make sense when we have people in this country who say having to wear a mask in a global pandemic is an infringement on their personal rights, and that's fine. I'm not taking issue with that necessarily, but how is it then that homeowners, business owners, community leaders are allowing the utilities and public utility commissions and large power companies to deny them the right to choose what they do with their homes, their businesses, and what assets they build in, and how they're being taxed for that, the solar tax, in other words?
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. There's so many different levels in which government can have influence, and sometimes the objectives of government and then individuals are influenced by special interest groups and stuff. So again, not to go after any one state, but it's the human condition. There's politics involved. Shocking. And so I can see that the development of new technologies and new ideas like this can be a struggle for sure.
Yeah, well, especially when the gas and oil industry continues to receive subsidies, even though they may be underperforming. If you look at the S&P 500, that the underperforming stocks, gas and oil, And it has led to the divestment movement and large pension funds looking at the returns and thinking about divesting. And really, it's the first time in history, I think, where it's almost a matter of fiduciary duty to divest from gas and oil if you're looking at stock performance, and specifically the S&P 500 in the last 5 years is a good example of that. But the issue of money, just to think about what has been estimated to bring our centralized infrastructure up to a carbon pollution-free electrical utility network by 2035 under the United Nations Paris Climate. It's estimated that just the generation infrastructure alone will cost $2 trillion in investment. Then if we look at the transmission piece of energy, the transmission system, it's estimated to be between 300 to 504 billion. So we haven't even gotten to the distribution piece of energy, but we're already up to 2,504 billion by 2035. That is, the money just isn't there. And if you look at what utilities have been doing up till now to invest in their own infrastructure, where is this money going to come from? Even the rates that customers have been paying to utilities, it has not been used for infrastructure upgrades. So what is the natural solution? It's for utilities and customers, their ratepayers, to work in partnership to build assets. Like I said before, it's not a zero-sum game, top-down versus distributed. It is centralized and distributed. It is fossil fuel and renewables. And really thinking about intelligent networks and assets that can be used to create the greatest outcome, the best outcome for citizens in the US, but also globally. And that's really, for me, I always look at the numbers and what is going to be required as investment. And those numbers are just not possible given our current policies, where money is being spent, and certainly how utilities have been investing up until 2022.
So there's still a significant number of challenges and resistances to more of a clean energy regime in our country. And I know there are some who are trying to push it so quickly that it also is creating issues in the fossil fuel industry in the short run, with gas at $7 a gallon, pipelines being shut down. And so there's a big backlash going on right now in the public to those kinds of activities. But yet I think everybody believes that we'd rather have cleaner energy, right? We don't want to defile our environment, but yet to get there is hard, and the costs, as you said, are huge. What we mentioned earlier, we did have a conversation with a gentleman in the oil industry who talked about how electric cars are all about oil, and it was a very provocative statement, and it got a lot of views nationally. But we talked a little bit about that. Do you want to weigh in on that idea? Is the oil industry really dominating electric car construction, or does that make no sense whatsoever?
Well, not having heard him make that statement in the context, I'm not sure how to refute it or provide an alternative view. But I will say the transportation sector is a very large contributor to our overall CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So the challenge with electric cars, of course, is if you're charging, and I have a hybrid, so I will charge my car at home, but I'm very aware of what I'm pulling through the grid and through my home to charge my car. So if we're charging fleets of electric cars, but we have to build more gas and oil and power plants, that's not necessarily solving the entire problem, although we are driving around in cars that aren't spewing emissions daily, and that does have value. But going back to this discussion about top-down centralized versus distributed, and it's an and, my home is a hybrid. So I can choose, knowing what my utility rates are, also when the sun is shining. I can plug my car in and charge it when it makes the most financial sense for me and when I know I'm pulling from the sun. And that is the proposition here. If we have a fleet of electric cars, we also need to be smart about how we're building in infrastructure very often at the customer site. If people have solar rooftop and they have batteries, so they can store that energy and deploy it at night during time of use or peak charges for businesses, but they also have an electric car or a fleet, then they can charge that car or their fleet pulling from batteries that are there on site. And that solves a huge piece of this question of emissions and reducing CO2. And so again, going back to your question and the statement by the gentleman, I would think he's talking about where you're actually generating the energy, what the source of that generation is, and how you're charging the electric fleet. And electric cars isn't the entire solution. You have to look at the all the way along the supply chain, value chain, and think about the technology at every point along the distribution.
You know, it's interesting. Yeah, there are lots of views on how all this is going to shake out. We did a recent podcast talking about how when we rented a Tesla on a recent business trip, we didn't actually plan on the 1 hour we had to sit at a charging station to charge the car before we went back to the airport. And then we started to come up with ideas about, well, what could business do with that hour? All the business people have to sit there at a charging station before they go back to Hertz, if Hertz would actually do electric vehicles. And so we came up with a lot of ideas. So while there are challenges, there are also opportunities as well at the same time. And we were sitting at a Wawa outside of Philadelphia going, God, I can't believe we're sitting at this charging for an hour. So there's challenges and there's huge opportunities at the same time.
Right. Well, in that example with just the singular electric car,
yeah,
it is appropriate and optimal to have just an electric car in some cases. But from going back to, again, my statement, it's not an either or zero sum game, but I think that people tend to look at that as certainly in the energy industry, because everybody's vying for that, the biggest piece, right? How are they going to make the most money? But for me, for our company, it's always an and. So my hybrid car is a perfect example. If I can charge it and draw from the sun and reduce emissions when I'm sitting on a highway like the 405 for 2 hours because there's an accident or it's just backup, I'm not emitting fumes. And I also charge my car from the sun. That's pretty powerful. But there are other times where during the fires, there is no sun to be had. The sky is an apocalyptic orange with raining ash for days or weeks at a time. And that is not an exaggeration. Right. And so there are times where, yes, I do have to run my car off of fossil fuels. That's okay. But overall, if I think about the emissions that I'm eliminating and the informed decision making I'm able to engage in real time, that's financial, that has to do with the assets I have. That's really where people should be going and thinking about in terms of the energy industry.
Yes. Well, and maybe as battery technology gets better and better, and a battery in a car can move a vehicle 700 or 800 miles, which is more than any one person would want to drive in a day, charging at night, then maybe that'll be solved as well. But right now we're still not there yet, right? Not quite. We're close, but not quite.
Exactly. And that's why hybrids make sense.
It does.
Right.
Well,
And it depends on your commute. If an all electric car makes sense, there should be a choice. And consumers need to have as much information as possible to make those choices. Beyond regulation, beyond incentives, what drives markets is consumer purchasing power. And so that's another prong of our company's mission, is to educate the consumer base, to really try and elevate some of these issues beyond partisan, beyond big line fossil fuel versus renewables. People really need to know that they do have choice, and that there's a lot of information available to drive decisions that make sense and improve their bottom line.
yeah. Well, Catherine, this is a really interesting discussion about all the things going on in America. But we did talk earlier a little bit about the United Nations and their SDGs and the UN Global Compact. And I know you're part of that, involved in that. And how does that support the company's mission? And what is really going on worldwide in this subject? America's a leader in many areas, but we're not always the leader. Where do we stand with the rest of the world? And tell us about the UN and their activity.
Well, the UN has what they have termed the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are actually 17 total goals, 16 of which are very specific, such as eliminate poverty, gender equity, access to clean water. Our company was nominated one year to represent goal number 9, innovation, infrastructure, and technology. So each of these 16 goals creates a sort of tangible target, if you will, for companies, for individuals to think about, how do we tackle these 16 goals? And then the 17th goal is partnerships, and how, as private companies, public companies, for-profit, nonprofit, how do we and governments come together to bear resources to take on these goals? For me, for SimpliPhi Power, I have always believed that companies have an opportunity, if not a responsibility, to have an impact on these issues that are captured in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or UN SDGs. And so the UN has given us an opportunity, if we think about the types of deployments we have, leveraging energy storage to make an impact. So you think about the 1.2 billion people around the world when we founded the company in 2010 that are marginalized simply because they don't have access to power. If you don't have power, you can't filter and have clean water. You don't have basic lighting, electricity for medical care, refrigeration. And so we again look at energy storage and what we do to make an impact on the UN SDGs. You bring in a microgrid, for example, to an island community that is otherwise dependent on importing all its fuel, which landed is very costly. And then in the island community, and generators are always oversized. If you're running a generator just to have some basic lighting at night for a small clinic in an island or a remote country, such as in Africa, it's a lot of precious dollars going to fuel that is then creating pollution and health impact. And so we've been deploying systems that make an impact. And when you bring energy storage with solar or wind and generators and create a system that optimizes each of those assets, then you make an impact. We make an impact on many of those goals out of the 16, and if not the 17, because we're always building partnerships to address those goals. So that's how those goals really align with our mission as a company. We're always thinking about the impact we make when we go into especially remote territories where we are bringing power where it wasn't available at all, or we are offsetting, reducing, or even eliminating diesel generators. The Global Compact, the UN Global Compact, is something different, but definitely aligned with the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Compact is really a call to action by the UN to get companies to join. And there are 4 primary prongs that are identified under the 10 goals of the Global Compact. And that has to do with human rights, labor, and anti-corruption. And so human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Yeah. And so for example, labor, the issue of paying living wages, that's still a debate in our country. When you think about overseas, what has happened in the US over the past 50 years, US corporations outsourcing so that they can improve their profits and their margins, and outsourcing depending on countries that don't just have a minimum wage, they have slave wages. And that certainly plays out in the energy industry as well when we talk about price versus cost. But as a company thinking about labor and equal employment opportunity, we have a very diverse team in terms of gender identity, diversity around race and ethnicity. And all the data bears out that companies that have a more diverse team have a stronger bottom line. And it's certainly been the case for us as we've doubled, tripled year over year. We've grown since 2010 based on our own revenue, a couple small rounds of friends and family, but never choosing to take on VC money, which meant we had to be laser focused on our technology, actually solving problems, not creating problems, because we were funding our own R&D and test and validation. So the UN Global Compact, from the labor issue around the example I gave, living wages, to environmental is an obvious one for us, but the anti-corruption is really critical. So that really helps us create an annual report. All the companies that are part of the UN Global Compact have to create an annual report to provide the progress that they've made year over year on the different metrics that are identified in those 4 categories, but 10 overriding points in the compact.
Well, it's great. I mean, you're obviously a leader in this field, and it's really great to hear what you're doing to help develop, cleaner energy, smarter ways of supplying energy to the country and the world. And it's great to see that the UN is behind it. I know America is clearly, a forward country in many ways. We're not the leaders in everything, but in some ways, Europe is ahead of us in certain areas as well. But the rest of the world kind of does follow our lead. And you look at Africa and other, South America, other continents, and in many ways are way behind. And we're learning, and then hopefully they learn from us. So the leadership is really key. Catherine, what do you see in the next 5 and maybe 10 years as far as the biggest opportunities and challenges for energy storage and the development of all the subjects we're discussing today?
Oh, big question.
You can handle.
I think one challenge that we still see is this regulatory environment that's ever changing and ever conflicting. So the regulations, for example, concerning lithium-ion batteries, there is a lack of differentiation across lithium-ion chemistries and manufacturing processes and materials. There is a lack of differentiation because really the earliest chemistry, the lithium cobalt oxide, the cobalt, is still the big player, but its legacy and all the hazards and dangers around lithium ion are thought to be relegated to one chemistry. And there are many different chemistries with different safety profiles. This lack of differentiation across chemistries, it will become clearer, again, with the 9540A, the UL 9540A and 9540 test and certifications, but it's still a challenge. New York City, where we have installations going in, if you think about Storm Sandy and some of the installations that have been deployed over the last year come out of the storm recovery governor's office. And we've had to jump through many different hoops because of the fear about lithium ion batteries. And as I said earlier, that fear is justified when there is cobalt and other types of issues like form factor and manufacturing. If you're trying to install energy storage at the customer site, but it's hazardous and you're fundamentally putting them at risk, you're not creating energy security. And so this is an issue that still plays out in very real ways, getting permits to allow for installations to happen, whether they're commercial or residential. You know, I'm glad to say we finally have our test results and certifications, but even then it's challenging. So the regulatory environment. Then some of the other issues I spoke of, the utilities and power companies that are lobbying and spending a lot of money. Here in California is a great example of really convincing people that, well, one message is solar is only for the wealthy, energy storage and solar is only for the wealthy. But if you look at the data, that is just not true. And the multi-family housing projects that we've been engaged in, but statistically, the lower income, underserved communities, everybody is participating in the distributed solar and energy storage markets. And the data is there beyond these sort of campaigns and talking points that are being kind of pushed out by sort of vested interest in traditional energy. So that will be an ongoing challenge. People being prevented because they just can't afford it to put solar on their roof and batteries in their garage to charge their electric car, or they don't have an electric car, just to offset the huge increases in their utility rates. This is not a wealthy issue. This is an issue that is really hurting working class and also underserved areas. And they still have been putting in solar and batteries, but with these new fees and what's being called the solar tax in California, it's not cost effective. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
How does that then sit with the mandates that are coming out of Sacramento or on the federal level of clean energy? And so that will continue to be a challenge. How regulations, mandates really sync up. And I think a lot of that has to do with money and government lobbying, and that's a shame. And then the last point I'll make is import tariffs. And this certainly played out in the solar industry, but I'll speak specifically in the energy storage industry. There are hefty import tariffs that are placed on cells, lithium ion cells, whether it's lithium iron phosphate, NMC, the nickel cobalt, or LCO, whatever the chemistry is. There are heftier tariffs put on to the extent that it's 25% to import what we've always considered a raw component, or a component that then we use in our manufacturing processes. Again, we manufacture our own batteries in Oxnard, California. And to us, job creation in the US job training, especially in the clean tech space, is so critical. So we have taken on the 25% import tariff for the right to manufacture here and create jobs. But you can cut that 25% import fee if instead of buying cells, again, what we consider the raw material that goes into our lithium iron phosphate batteries, you can cut that to 7.5% or lower if you just white label lithium batteries that are being made in China or other parts in Southeast Asia and import them.
Okay.
So what that's doing is it's encouraging within the energy storage sector for companies, some of our competitors, which I will not name, but all they do is they white label batteries that are fully built overseas that benefit in terms of price point in the US market, but because of slave wages overseas, substandard factory manufacturing processes, and it creates a cost advantage in the market. Our federal government really needs to begin to understand what these tariffs are doing. Ultimately, the US taxpayer consumer ends up paying for these tariffs. And we've seen this in the energy industry and certainly in the renewable energy industry. But if the US government is really about creating jobs and creating jobs that in the clean tech sector, firmware, software, hardware, manufacturing processes, as they've been saying since the shortages in PPEs came about because of COVID, as a country, we can't manufacture much of what we need. So it's all the more critical when we think about job creation, especially in technology and the clean tech sector specifically, that the tariffs make sense. Are we really encouraging manufacturing jobs in the US, or are we undercutting manufacturing jobs and it's still beneficial for companies, corporations to outsource because they'll pay lower tariffs and have a competitive advantage in the US market? And that is a very real challenge that we are facing and have been facing for years, and it needs to change.
Wow, this has been a fascinating discussion. And, there are many, many challenges to any new technology and development in society, whether it be, technological challenges, and then, of course, politics, money, and people. You'd mentioned, and that's not going to change either. But it does appear that with clean energy, we're moving in the right direction in America and in the world, and that's exciting to hear. We're also trying to replace the smog-filled cities like Los Angeles in the 70s, and recently we were in Bombay, India, and you see the smog; it's unbelievable. So we're moving in the right direction, and it's really great to hear what you have to say. And thank you for being a leader in that industry. And maybe we can check in again later on to hear more as things develop. So
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This has been a great discussion. And thanks everybody today for being with us on the Today's Market Explained 4-Star podcast. And thank you, Catherine, for joining us, and hope to see you again very soon.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.